All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
And welcome back to the X Zone, everyone. What a night it's been. Our first guest, we were talking about psychic phenomena, tarot cards. Last hour, we were talking about demons, exorcisms, and things that go wacko in the night. And I figured out a new acronym for wacko, or Waco. We ain't coming out. That's what the demons are saying these days. And this hour, Mark McCandlish is my special guest. We've had the pleasure of having Mark on the show before. He's an internationally recognized artist who has specialized in aviation and conceptual art within the defense and aerospace industries for the better part of his last 30 years, serving the needs of many of the top American corporations in this regard. Mark's father was a 25-year veteran of the United States Air Force, and as a consequence, Mark had a lifelong love of aviation and aviation history. His first UFO sighting was at Westover Air Force Base in the state of Massachusetts in the winter of 1966, and he observed the craft through an 80-power telescope for about 10 minutes before it accelerated out of sight at an alarming velocity. He later discovered that this craft had been hovering above a flight of nuclear-armed B-52s sitting at the alert ramp on the flight line at that base. Mark spent most of his life trying to discover the science that would be behind such a incredible performance, and if it was actually possible, and he believes there's a plausible answer to interstellar flight without violating the currently accepted laws of physics. Having literally dozens of sightings since 1966, Mark feels that this is carefully protected technology and has been co-opted by a yet unknown group. And the sequestration of this technology has provided that organization tremendous leverage in world politics, finance, and international conflicts over the past 5 decades. www.markmccandlish is his website. And Mark, always great having you here on the X Zone, my friend. How have you been?
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much for having me back. Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you.
Excellent. You know, with what's happening in the Middle East these days, we've got the United States back involved in a theater where even though the president is saying no boots will hit the ground, they've already got over 3,000 boots on the ground. We're using technology, drone technology, high surveillance aircraft technology in order to find the targets that will be targeted by not only the United States but other countries around the world. And it seems, Mark, whenever these new theaters of operation open up, we don't hear a lot about UFO sightings, not only in the area but around the world. And I was wondering, Mark, do you have any idea why this is?
Well, as it turns out, Rob, in recent months, there has been a marked increase in the number of UFO sightings, in spite of what you may have heard elsewhere in the media.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Peter Davenport has been reporting an unusually high number of UFO sightings over the past few months. And in fact, I've actually talked to servicemen who've come back from the Middle East ever since the Persian Gulf War, who did in fact see UFOs over combat theater areas.
But these UFOs that these fine men and women who protect us, that are coming back from these theaters around the world, is it possible that what they're experiencing and what they're seeing are actually new technology surveillance aircraft?
I have no doubt. I think that's pretty much foregone conclusion. Mm-hmm. The average person looks at the level of aerospace technology that's out there right now, and they tend to think of the SR-71 Blackbird as being, the sort of epitome of aerospace technology,
right,
when in fact that was an aircraft that was being designed in the late 50s, early 1960s, was flying in the 1960s, and was retired a few years ago. But there are things that fly much higher and much faster now. In fact, there are things that use some pretty exotic propulsion systems. I've had occasion to see a few of these things. and they're truly remarkable.
Whatever happened, Mark, to the Aurora? That used to be so prevalent in the UFO community that a lot of the early UFO researchers were kind of tending to believe, oh, wait a minute, that's not a UFO, that's the Aurora. And then, bang, we don't hear about it anymore.
Well, there were several generations of aircraft in that particular program. The first aircraft in that particular family of vehicles was an unmanned area vehicle. It was probably one of the largest, highest flying and fastest flying aircraft or unmanned aircraft in the inventory. That particular vehicle was somewhat shaped like a flattened out football, sort of a diamond shape, very similar to what Ben Rich or Kelly Johnson referred to as the hopeless diamond shape. It was entirely covered with space shuttle tiles, had 121 vertical launch tubes in its belly for supporting different kinds of munitions, both conventional weapons and nuclear warheads.
Mark, we're going to have to do a bit of a cliffhanger here. I've got to take my first break here. Mark McCandlish is my special guest, a great friend of the X-Zone. www.markmccandlish.com. And Mark and I will be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Mark McCandlish is my guest this hour, Exonation, www.markmccandlish.com. And before we went to the commercial break, Mark, you and I were discussing the Aurora. And please go on with that, because I'm sure there's a lot of old guys like me who'd like to know what really happened.
Well, that particular aircraft was capable of traveling at speeds up to Mach 17, which is roughly 12,000 miles per hour.
Wow.
Of course, that depends to a large degree on the altitude and the air density at which you're flying. Use some pretty exotic fuels, and there's been some debate about whether it was a methane-based or a slush, partially solidified hydrogen-type fuel. But it had three different propulsion systems, one that would allow it to take off and land from an airfield with engines very similar to the high bypass turbojet engines that were used in the SR-71. But then it had an external propulsion system that was an awful lot like what is called a linear aerospike engine. And what this really was constructed out of was a slight ridge that ran laterally across both the dorsal and ventral surfaces, had a series of what looked like fuel injectors pointing outward, and once it got up to a particular velocity, fuel would be sprayed intermittently into the airstream right at the trailing edge of the ridge, and it would basically combust and expand between the supersonic shock wave that separated from the surface of the vehicle at that point and the tapered afterbody. So it more or less pinched the afterbody, driving it forward. So it was the entire back end of the aircraft was like a linear aerospace engine. The problem was that it had a tendency to erode the space shuttle tiles very rapidly when the engine was running nonstop, and so they began experimenting, and they found that the best way to operate this particular configuration was in a pulsed detonation kind of an operation where they would spray fuel out for about 5 seconds, and then they would rest for 10. So once it got up to speed, it was basically pulsing on and turning off, and for this reason, it was nicknamed the Pulsar, the Aurora Pulsar. The vehicle was unique in that it had tires that looked like that. You've probably been to a car show, occasionally seen special hoses that people put on their engines that have kind of a braided sort of stainless steel mesh wire structure to the hoses. Well, imagine a loop of that wrapped around a wheel, and that's what the tires look like on this particular aircraft. And that was a design that was specifically meant to be able to withstand the unusually high temperatures that the airframe was subject to.
So what happened to it? Why did they...
Well, from what I've heard, the aircraft was not that reliable. In fact, one of the contractors that I'd done some work for through Lockheed had indicated that there was an occasion where a vehicle of this type was coming into Edwards Air Force Base, had a problem cycling from the high-speed engine set to the turbo ramjets or turbo high-bypass turbojets that would allow it to land. And so the pilot who was operating the vehicle remotely was instructed to take the aircraft out over the ocean and sort out the problem, and if not able to resolve it, to put it into the drink so it wouldn't be recovered. It took him 15 minutes to sort out the problem so that he could bring the aircraft back to Edwards and land it, and by that time he was over Hawaii. So if you look at the distance to Hawaii from
Holy
Edwards,
cow.
it's about 3,000 miles, accomplished in 15 minutes, which means that you're traveling 3,000 times 4, 12,000 miles per hour, and depending on the altitude, that's Mach 17. So this is in 1986. So that gives you an idea of just how truly advanced some of these vehicles are or were at that time, and now we're looking, almost 30 years later. So you have to imagine that the kinds of vehicles that are out there are probably even more remarkable. I know that there was a second generation in that family of aircraft because I was asked to do some conceptual artwork for the follow-up second generation aircraft. And, I can't really talk about what that vehicle looked
understandable.
But I can tell you that it was capable of a similar performance in terms of its speed and altitude. Probably a little bit more conventional in terms of its appearance. In other words, vertical stabilizers and that kind of thing. So that there were some things that it could do. And in fact, a number of these aircraft even have internal rocket engines so that they can do a maneuver that's called a zoom climb, where they go into a shallow dive from high altitude and then they pull up and they can go right out into space, go exo-atmospheric as they call it, and loiter for extremely long periods of time. That's one of the reasons why you would want the vehicle to be a remotely operated or an unmanned aerial vehicle, because that way you literally have indefinite, unlimited loiter time, which means you don't have to worry about pilots that have to go to the bathroom or need to eat and sleep. You can just have somebody in basically a cockpit suite at a base like Indian Springs in Nevada that's uplinked through satellites and can operate completely from the ground and perform all of the parameters of the aircraft's mission. So
fascinating. On this show, we talk about government conspiracies and cover-ups and reverse engineering. I have a hard time believing that with what you talk about, with what the people from different aerospace engineering corporations that we've had on the show, the people from NASA that we've had on the show, and the people from the military that we've had on the show, I have a hard time believing that UFOs have crashed, the engines have been reverse engineered, and this is where we're getting the technology of today from. I have a hard time with that. What is your opinion as someone who's in the industry?
There's a couple of ways you can look at this particular idea, and that is, one, is there life elsewhere in the universe? Mm-hmm. And probably the simplest way to approach that question is to look at the other stars around us and to see from spectrographic data that the structure of those stars, the kinds of things in terms of the space dust, if you will, that's floating around these stars, has a lot of the same kinds of materials that we have here. So one can imagine that if given enough time, that life could develop on these planets and maybe even get to the point where we're sentient and thinking up ways of getting out into space like we have been for many years. In terms of the physics of being able to go from one place to another, naturally you're talking about some pretty exotic technology, and you have to understand how the systems work and how they essentially do a workaround on all of the limitations that Einstein and other geniuses pretty much stipulated that we would have to confront if we were ever going to make it to the nearest star. First and foremost is an energy that's embedded in the fabric of space-time that's responsible for mass and inertia. It's the underlying cause for gravity itself. And so if you understand what this energy is and you understand how to tap into that energy, not only do you have a tremendous resource in terms of alternative energy production that doesn't have some of the negative byproducts like fossil fuels do.
Right.
There are some radioactive and radioisotopic considerations for that particular kind of thing. But if you are able to tap into that energy and do it in just the right way, you can essentially reduce the mass of your vehicle, so the idea of accelerating up to and beyond the speed of light actually becomes a possibility, because instead of seeing an increase in your mass as you accelerate through space-time, all of the energy that would be responsible for that increase in mass is actually converted to propulsive force. So energy is conserved, and you can actually break the light speed barrier. And in fact, I'm positive that someone in the aerospace industry has accomplished this, and that there's probably an awful lot of people nervously fidgeting as they're listening to me talk about this, because the technology does exist, and it's only a matter of time before some of the other countries around the world figure it out for themselves.
But what happens if Einstein only had part of the formula right? And
well, that's exactly the point, is that Einstein, in spite of his tremendous genius, kind of gave us a clue right in the middle of it all. And that was when he talked about the idea that the faster you go and the closer you come to the speed of light, that your mass begins to increase. And as it increases, the closer you get to the speed of light, it becomes almost infinite. And this is because the energy that's embedded in space-time, the so-called quantum zero-point fluctuations of the vacuum, or zero-point energy as it's sometimes called, this energy is the very energy that these kinds of propulsion systems tap into. So the faster you go, you literally find that there is more energy available to you as you go faster. So, and at the same time, the very thing that you would ordinarily expect to increase the mass of your vehicle is being used up so quickly that it can't contribute to the increase in mass. So your vehicle actually becomes relatively lighter, so to speak. The mass is reduced. You've heard people talking about inertial dampening, and
yes,
that is the same kind of principle. I mean, it sounds like something you'd hear on Stargate SG-1 or some science fiction TV show, but these are real principles that are being talked about, things that have actually been considered. Robert L. Forward, a well-known scientist who passed away a number of years ago, was actually preparing and performed a number of experiments having to do with what is called mass modification. So anytime something accelerates through space-time, its interaction with this energy in space-time increases, and that's what actually causes the effect of mass to become greater. But when something slows down and returns back to its state of rest, so to speak, all that energy is dissipated back into the environment. So the trick is to use the energy that's there, that's causing this phenomenon, for something other than increasing your mass. You use it to do just the opposite. You use it to propel you at faster and faster speeds, while at the same time causing your mass to become less. And this is how you break the light barrier. This is how interstellar travel is possible. And in fact, NASA has recently unveiled some artwork on a new spaceship that's probably going to be employing this very kind of technology. It looks like sort of a stereotypical spaceship in the middle with big rings around it, and those rings are actually part of the mechanism that makes this possible.
Mark, stand by. You and I have to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. Exonation, Mark McCandlish is our very special guest this hour, www.markmccandlish.com. My name is Rob McConnell. This is the X Zone. And to all our Scottish listeners tonight, it's nice to see that everyone stayed with the United Kingdom. It had me a little worried there. Now, what would happen to the Scotch? That was my question. We'd have to depend on the aliens, I guess. No, not the ones from Mars, the ones from Mexico. We'll be back. Don't go away.
This is Elizabeth Joyce with Stargazing week of September 15th through the 21st. This week brings abundant social opportunities, and you feel a bit talkative. Talk to a wide variety of people, but don't believe everything you hear. It is a good time to explore numerous ideas, projects, and philosophies, but know that not all of them will come down to earth for you. There isn't much to say about this week except that it will be pleasant. Expect invitations, travel, and meeting new people. With this overflow of advantageous energy, the week invites you to set your intentions on hope and satisfaction. Everyday energy has been low recently, and your feeling is that it's been hard to know how to focus where your attention should be. With Mars entering Sagittarius, clarity comes. You are in a take-charge mode, ready to take on a challenge, and willing to put yourself out in order to get what you want. This is a powerful time for attracting romance and creative attention. There may be some competitive feelings between you and a significant other now. Focus on reconciliation, forming or cementing bonds, diplomacy, consultation, one-on-one interactions, and negotiations. You may feel a little drained physically temporarily. Belief that you have been uncertain about suddenly become clear at the end of the week. Friendships may be intense, but instead of brooding over problems, you're motivated to make important changes that bring you closer to resolution on long-standing problems. Remember, conflicts are not set in stone, and most easily can be resolved with just a change of attitude. When it comes to income, you're challenged to think outside the box in order to come up with viable plans to improve your finances, and this theme will be with you through the end of the year. Don't limit yourself when it comes to thinking up novel and unique ideas. New technology or methods can really improve your daily life. There may be sudden discoveries or epiphanies that can help you improve your lifestyle, particularly with health and wellness. You may feel a challenge with authority or a desire to break out of financial restrictions this week. Be sure to apply a large dose of common sense to any dreams or schemes, and you could be in for a wild ride and a memorable adventure. If you don't, you're going to be kicking yourself all the way through October. A Leo moon on the weekend has you wanting to spend time in social situations where you can open your heart without concern. It's a warm and generous time. Sunday night, the night before the fall equinox, is a kind of an odd time. The moon moves into Virgo late in the evening, which supports service, simplicity, and accomplishing your list of tasks. At the same time, Neptune is busy, especially in the evening, and that is a space-out and daydream kind of energy. So part of you wants to work and part of you can't get it together. Watch a movie Sunday evening. That's a Neptune activity. Enjoy.
And for more information, Exonation, you can visit Elizabeth Joyce's website at www.new-visions.com. Mark McCandlish is our special guest this hour, www.markmccandlish.com. And Mark, during the commercial break with the news, we were talking about chemtrails. And I was wondering if I could get your take on chemtrails. Are they chemical trails or are they vapor trails?
Well, you have both kinds. You have the typical contrails that usually dissipate within 30 seconds to a minute, but there are other items that are being added into the fuel. Now, NASA has a number of scientific papers you can actually find up on the web that describe what they call metallized fuels or gelated and metallized fuels. And now it includes things like Jet A and JP7 or JP8, I believe it may be. The idea behind these things is you have to understand some of what goes on during the combustion process in a turbojet engine. One, of course, is that you spray fuel into an airstream that's being compressed by the turbine blades, and once it gets to a sort of a critical point where it necks down to a point of high compression and high speed, there is an ignition that occurs, and the explosion or the combustion process tends to expand outward out the exhaust, driving another set of turbine blades that are, of course, connected through a common propeller shaft between the two sets. So in order to enhance the efficiency of that process, if you can introduce more oxygen into the combustion, then you can make it burn at higher temperatures. You can make it burn more efficiently using less fuel. And one of the ways to do that is to introduce metal oxides into the fuel. Aluminum oxide is the metal of choice because it consists of 2 atoms of aluminum and 3 atoms of oxygen. It's totally inert while it's in the fuel. And, of course, if you understand that the higher you go in altitude, the thinner the air is, if you can include part of your oxygen supply right in the fuel itself, it means that not only can you go higher where the air is thinner and where it provides less, frictional resistance against the passage of the aircraft. But it also allows you to have a more complete combustion of the fuel. So theoretically, at least, to some degree, you're creating less pollution because you're burning more of the fuel efficiently by introducing these oxides. The problem is that the aluminum oxide residue remains in the air and basically falls out, comes back to Earth. And aluminum oxide is unusual, and it's one of the reasons why it's used in thermate is because, or high-temperature explosives, because it will constantly recombine with oxygen to form a new aluminum oxide particle. And when these materials settle back down to the Earth, of course, the nanoparticles that are being used are small enough to be absorbed through the root structure of the plants. They settle on the plants in the forest. So when there's a fire, the fire tends to burn much more intensely, is much more difficult to suppress. In fact, if you look at some of the stats from different states, like here in California, and some of the figures coming from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, you'll find that the number of square acres and the cost to suppress forest fires in California alone have doubled in the last 10 years. And it's only been since about 2000 that they really began chemtrailing in earnest on a regular basis. Now, as far as global warming and so forth is concerned, there's a gentleman, I think his name is Leonard Box. I'm not sure if that's his name. He's a climatologist, is working up in the Arctic, and he's finding that a lot of the soot that's coming from these forest fires is actually settling out in the Arctic, and it's reducing the so-called albedo. I think it's albedo, if I got that correct. But he indicates that by reducing the reflectivity of the ice, it's actually causing the temperature to increase, and it's melting off at 3 times the speed that they thought of. So you were asking me about an increase in the layers of ice in the Antarctic and in the Arctic area, and this is only a temporary measure, and I'll explain why. When ice is formed and it falls to the ground in the form of snow or hail or what have you, it's distilled water. It has absolutely no chemical composition to it at all. Aside from the soot that's falling out and whatever aluminum oxide there might be in the composition of this, those things are a separate consideration, because when the ice melts and it goes out to sea, it remains basically like desalinated water, and it has a lower specific gravity. That essentially means that because it has no minerals dissolved in it, it weighs less. And because it weighs less, it basically floats on the surface of the ocean. And so the surface of the ocean, which regulates temperatures in the northern and southern hemispheres, those temperatures are suddenly colder. And so you see what appears to be a spurt of colder temperatures, colder winters. You see cycles where you see extreme heat in the summer, extreme cold in the winter. So you think, aha, global warming is a hoax. There's nothing going on. The problem is, using the Atlantic Ocean as an example, you have the Gulf Stream current coming up the east coast of the United States, which is extremely warm water, heavily laden with minerals, because warmer water, of course, will allow you to dissolve more minerals in the water. So the water weighs more. It's heavier. And as a result, the current is being pushed to the bottom of the ocean floor by this cold water that's hovering on the surface because it has a lower specific gravity. It weighs less, so it floats. And as a result, this warm water is being pushed to the bottom of the North Atlantic, where it is now melting off all of the methane hydrate deposits on the sea floor. Now, that may not sound like a bad deal because, of course, we can always use more fossil fuels, and methane, of course, is a kind of fossil fuel. The problem is that methane, when it gets up into the atmosphere, is far more destructive to the ozone layer than carbon dioxide ever dreamed of being. It's almost as bad for the upper atmosphere as chlorofluorocarbons, freon, things like that. And so now they're finding tremendous plumes of methane that are coming up off the ocean floor. Some are so severe, the bubbles that are coming up off the ocean floor from the melt-off and the gasification of this methane is so severe that ships, maritime ships out in the ocean, are being directed around these plumes of methane gas because the buoyancy factor of the water is dramatically reduced. And anytime you put a lot of bubbles in the water, it will not support a ship as effectively. In fact, ships have been known to sink when they pass through these plumes.
Wow. So,
Yeah,
so global warming is real.
Yeah, it is. And in fact, I think what we're going to find is that we'll have a dramatic pendulum effect where it swings back and forth between extremely hot summers, extremely cold winters, and then somewhere along the line we're going to have a threshold event where the warmth is going to hit. It's kind of like the latent heat experiments we did with ice cubes in high school science class, where suddenly the temperature of the water hits a particular point and the ice melts very quickly. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, where a lot of the ice that is above sea level, that is on the land masses like in Greenland and Iceland, these particular masses of ice are going to begin to break up and flow out to sea. And, of course, we may see this sort of swinging back and forth, the pendulum effect, like I was saying before, with high temperatures in the summer and cold temperatures in the wintertime. But I think in the end, global warming is going to win out, and we're going to see a sudden rise in sea levels probably within the next 10 to 15 years. That's my prediction anyway.
So why do you think there's so much controversy over the existence and the reality of global warming?
Well, I think the big problem was that there are some scientists that have a tremendous amount of time and study and research invested. They're emotionally invested in what they see happening, and you can't blame them. I mean, if you really understand the mechanisms of what's going on. But the problem is that you have a handful of scientists that have falsified their data because they see, they can read between the lines and they can really see what's going on. And so in order to really make their point, they, did the almost unpardonable sin of falsifying data. And so all the other climatologists that, are looking at this same problem all sort of get painted with the same broad brush. And this is a mistake. It's kind of like saying the science is all in, we can never travel faster than the speed of light, and Santa Claus doesn't exist. And, I mean, you make all these giant conclusions about something that is going on because you don't have all the data yet. And that's the real problem. If you look at the average temperature of the oceans worldwide over the past 10, 20 years, you'll find that there's been a creep, an upward creep in those temperatures, just a few degrees centigrade over the course of several decades. But it doesn't have to go very far before you find a very difficult time sustaining sea ice because the water temperature is not there to keep it frozen. And so when that happens, when this ice begins to melt, the sea levels will rise. And the first areas that it's going to affect, surprisingly, are places like Texas and Florida and the Middle East, all the places where we have known in the past to get large quantities of oil. So, of course, the oil industry was probably thrilled with this idea because that means they'll be able to jack up the price for all the oil that's now more difficult to get to. So you can see how there are certain things here that play to the wants and the needs of certain segments of industry.
So is it industry? Is it the carbon footprint? Is it a combination that is causing global warming, or is there any one specific cause that you believe is the culprit?
Well, in the beginning I thought the chemtrails were actually intended to try and reflect a lot of the solar radiation back out into space. In fact, one of the terms you hear often associated with chemtrails and geoengineering is solar radiation management, or SRM. And the idea is that you put up these highly reflective particles in the air that stay suspended in the atmosphere for long periods of time that tend to reflect that heat away from the surface. The problem is that when these same particles settle out, and especially the aluminum oxide, and it becomes, as it's floating down through the air, it actually increases the electrostatic potential of the air because aluminum is a conductor. It's used in high-tension power lines, for example. And so it makes lightning strikes that much easier to occur. And so you look at this and you see, well, okay, if forest fires are what is causing the albedo of the Arctic ice to be reduced because of the soot that's being produced from forest fires, why on earth would you want to put something in the atmosphere that's going to lead to more lightning strikes and therefore more forest fires? And then, on top of everything else, there was a video that was put up on YouTube recently with physicist Michio Kaku talking about how they've developed trillion-watt lasers now that can actually bring lightning strikes down from the sky because the laser beam itself, it raises the ionization level of the air. So if you already have these aluminum particles in the air and you have an airborne laser, you can literally pick and choose where the lightning strikes occur. Now, we had a fire up here in Northern California about 2-3 weeks ago called the Eiler Fire. It's spelled E-I-L-E-R. It was northwest of Redding, where I live, near the community of Bernie. And after this fire started because of a lightning strike, they started talking about how the moisture that was being produced by the fire, burning up all of the forests in that area, was producing its own weather system, and then they had even more lightning strikes. But they plotted the lightning strikes and put this in a graph that was put on the cover of the Record Searchlight newspaper. You can actually go back and find this particular issue. And this particular, let's see, I think I've got it right here in front of me. That anybody who wants to
listen, Mark. What I'd like to do is I'd like to hold this because I've got to take my break, and when we come back, I'd love to hear what this article says.
Okay.
Exo Nation, Mark McCandlish is always a special guest here on the Exxon, www.markmccandlish.com, and Mark and I will be back on the other side of this short commercial break as we continue here in the X-Zone in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And if you'd like to send an email, xzone at xzoneradiotv.com, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Once again, Mark McCandlish's website, www.markmccandlish.com. We'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Exo Nation, Mark McCandlish is our special guest, www.markmccandlish.com. Mark, we were talking about a newspaper article before we went to the break, so tell us about it.
Well, this was the Record Searchlight here in Reading. You can find it at reading.com. The particular issue I'm talking about is Tuesday, August 5th, 2014. The headline is Crews Attempt Iranian Fires. The subtitle, sub-headline is Intermountain Blazes Burn 100 Square Miles. Now, below that, there's a diagram of the fire area up in the vicinity of Bernie, California. Mm-hmm. And what I was mentioning before about precipitating lightning strikes using laser beams, they have a graph showing all the different lightning strikes that occurred during the thunderstorm that passed through this area. And each one of the red dots where these lightning strikes occur, this looks like a checkerboard pattern, Rob. I mean, it's almost a perfect graphic with lines that run north and south and lines that run east and west at evenly spaced intervals. And I defy any meteorologist to tell me that this is typical of what you would find in a cumulonimbus weather system with lightning strikes coming down, putting down a perfect checkerboard pattern of lightning strikes.
So how do we explain it?
Well, like I was saying before the break, physicist Michio Kaku was talking about how you could actually send a laser beam up through storm clouds and create an ionization path that would actually make it easier. Charged particles that are left behind would make it easier for the lightning strike to follow the path of the laser beam back down to the ground. But it works in both directions. You can do it from the sky. Now, back in the late 80s, early 1990s, I worked with Boeing and Rockwell International, who were competitors in the airborne laser program. They actually produced a chemical laser that was put into a modular form and rolled into the belly of a 747, had a huge turret on the front of it that looked like a giant glass eyeball. And this thing could shoot a laser beam hundreds of miles. And of course, the higher you go in the atmosphere, the further it'll go because the air is thinner. It'll propagate much further. But shooting straight down to the ground is something, I mean, the system was actually designed that it could be compacted down into the belly of a C-130, which is something that you often see being flown by the California Department of Forestry and Firefighting. So it's not unlike or I should say, it's not impossible for a system of this type to be installed in an aircraft and then used to physically begin stimulating lightning strikes that then precipitate a much larger fire. So you can see how, I mean, if you want to talk about conspiracy theories, I mean, what better way, and people scoff and laugh at you and say, chemtrails, conspiracy theorists, you don't know what you're talking about. But when you look at the ingredients that are in these chemtrails that have been analyzed, you see barium salts, you see strontium, aluminum oxide in nanoparticles as part of what they call nanothermate. It's a microscopical set of particles, and we're talking about things that are smaller than a red blood cell. And the reason that these chemical these particles are so significant is because when you reduce these kinds of materials down to a tremendously small size, you're vastly increasing the surface area for which a chemical reaction can propagate through the material. It's the same as if you say try to light a match to a log and it takes forever to get it started, but if you turn that log into sawdust and you throw it up in the air and toss a match in the middle of it, it's like a fuel air explosive. Yeah. It's very destructive.
Mark, I hate to do this, pal, but we're out of time for tonight. I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's always great having you. We'll have to do a special 2-segment show with you one night.
I'd love that.
Well, we'll make it happen, and I'll have our people contact you, and we'll work something out.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate the time.
My pleasure, sir. Mark McCandlish has been our guest this hour. www.markmccandlish.com. I'll be back on the other side of the news at 6.5 minutes past the top of the hour as the X Zone continues with yours truly, Rob McConnell. Don't go away.